Under flashing red and blue lights, a power-tripping rookie thought he'd caught an easy target in the back of a tinted SUV. He saw a well-dressed black woman and decided it was his night to play king of the road. What he didn't know was that he had just pulled over the highest-ranking state Supreme Court justice in the district. And those two silent men in the front seats? They weren't her chauffeurs. They were highly trained executive protection agents. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the black Chevrolet Suburban as it carved its way through the winding, heavily wooded stretches of Route 114. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a sanctuary of controlled quiet, broken only by the rhythmic, muted thumping of the windshield wipers and the soft hum of the dual-zone climate control. The heavy ballistic doors sealed away the roar of the storm, creating a mobile fortress for the woman seated in the rear passenger compartment. Honorable Justice Josephine Langford was exhausted. At 62, she was the first black woman to serve as the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, a position she had earned through 3 decades of relentless, unyielding dedication to the law. She leaned her head back against the pristine leather headrest, closing her eyes for just a fraction of a second. The silver strands woven through her tightly coiled hair caught the ambient amber glow of the highway street lamps passing by overhead. She had just spent the last 4 hours at a high-profile legal symposium, delivering a keynote address on the fragile intersection of civil rights and modern law enforcement. The irony of the evening's topic was about to manifest itself in the most visceral way possible. In the front seats, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was relaxed, but hummed with a low-voltage, ever-present vigilance. Driving the heavy SUV was Wyatt Hughes, a 30-year-old former military police officer turned executive protection specialist. His hands rested lightly but firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly scanning the slick, wet asphalt and the dark tree lines framing the road. Beside him sat Dominic Russo, the lead of Justice Langford's personal security detail. Dominic was a 20-year veteran of the State Police's Elite Protection Division, a man whose resting heart rate never seemed to spike, no matter the circumstance. "We are about 20 minutes out from the residence, Justice Langford," Dominic murmured, not turning around, his eyes fixed on the passenger-side side mirror. "Traffic is light, but the roads are pooling. We'll be taking it slow through the valley." "Take your time, Dominic," Josephine replied, her voice smooth and deeply resonant, carrying the natural authority of a woman who commanded courtrooms with a single syllable. "I have no desire to rush. I still have 3 appellate briefs to review before morning." Several miles behind them, nestled in the dark median of the highway, Officer Bradley Mitchell sat in his idling patrol cruiser. Mitchell was a man deeply frustrated by his own mediocrity. 5 years on the force, he had watched younger, sharper officers pass him by for promotions to detective and specialized units. He blamed everyone but himself: the brass, the system, and most frequently, the changing demographics of the county he patrolled. Tonight, he was cold, bored, and nursing a simmering anger over a reprimand he had received earlier that week for excessive use of force during a routine traffic stop. Mitchell gripped the steering wheel of his cruiser, his knuckles white, staring out into the downpour. He was actively looking for an excuse. He wanted to exert control over something, someone, anything. Through the sheet of rain, the black Suburban crested the hill. It was moving at exactly 45 miles per hour, perfectly compliant with the posted speed limit. But to Mitchell, it looked like an affront. The vehicle was entirely blacked out. The windows possessed a heavy, dark tint, legal for state-owned executive vehicles, but highly suspicious to an officer looking for a reason to strike. Because of the heavy rain and the glare of the streetlights, Mitchell entirely missed the subtle, recessed official state government plates mounted on the front and rear bumpers. "Look at this guy," Mitchell muttered to himself, his lips curling into a sneer. Thinks he owns the road, probably running drugs or moving stolen property. It was a baseless, absurd assumption, born entirely of Mitchell's own prejudiced worldview. A high-end vehicle with tinted windows on his stretch of road late at night was automatically guilty of something. He shifted his cruiser into drive, the heavy engine roaring to life, and aggressively pulled out of the median, kicking up a massive spray of muddy water. Inside the Suburban, Wyatt noticed the headlights immediately. "We picked up a local unit," Wyatt said calmly, his voice flat and analytical. "Coming up fast in the left lane. He's riding my blind spot." Dominic shifted his broad shoulders, his hand instinctively resting near the center console where the secure communications radio sat. "Acknowledge. Maintain speed. Don't give him a reason to think we're evasive." Mitchell tailgated the Suburban for a full mile. He ran the plates through his onboard computer, but because the plates were heavily encrypted, state executive tags, the local dispatch system returned a restricted, delayed result. Instead of waiting for the proper clearance code from the state database, Mitchell let his impatience and arrogance win. He slammed his hand against the control panel, activating his light bar. A blinding barrage of red and blue strobes flooded the rain-soaked highway, reflecting off the wet pavement and lighting up the interior of the Suburban. "He's lighting us up," Wyatt announced, his tone utterly devoid of panic. He didn't brake suddenly. He signaled, smoothly changing lanes, and began searching for a safe, well-lit shoulder to pull over. "Let him," Justice Langford said from the back seat, setting her reading glasses down on top of her leather briefcase. She wasn't nervous. She was intensely annoyed. "It's a miserable night for a traffic stop. Let's handle this quickly and professionally, so the man can get out of the rain." Wyatt found a wide stretch of shoulder near an underpass and brought the heavy SUV to a gentle, complete stop. He immediately threw the vehicle into park, turned off the engine to ensure no accidental movement, and switched on the interior dome lights. It was standard protocol for a law enforcement stop. Make the interior visible, keep hands on the wheel, and ensure the officer feels safe. Behind them, Mitchell parked his cruiser at an aggressive, protective angle. He stepped out into the freezing rain, pulling his collar up, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. He rested his right hand deliberately on the butt of his service weapon. He was walking into this encounter not as a public servant conducting a traffic stop, but as an apex predator asserting his dominance. He had no idea he was walking straight into a hurricane. The rain battered Officer Mitchell's shoulders as he marched toward the black SUV. In his left hand, he gripped a heavy tactical flashlight, its beam so intensely bright it cut through the sheets of water like a solid object. He didn't approach the driver's side window with caution. He approached it with entitlement. He stopped just behind the B-pillar, shining the blinding beam directly into the side mirror to disorient the driver before stepping forward. Wyatt pressed the window control, lowering the heavy ballistic glass exactly halfway. The sound of the storm rushed into the quiet cabin, along with the distinct smell of wet asphalt and ozone. Wyatt kept both of his hands firmly gripped on the top of the steering wheel, clearly visible. "Evening, officer," Wyatt said. His voice was steady, polite, and completely devoid of the fear or deference Mitchell expected. Mitchell leaned down, thrusting the flashlight straight into Wyatt's face. He took in Wyatt's appearance, a young, athletic black man wearing a sharply tailored dark suit. Mitchell's jaw tightened. The profile he had constructed in his mind was hardening into a deeply racist reality. He didn't see a professional. He saw a target who was entirely too comfortable in an expensive vehicle. "License, registration, and proof of insurance. Right now!" Mitchell snapped, bypassing any standard greeting or explanation for the stop. "Officer, if you could lower the flashlight, I would be happy to retrieve my credentials. They are in my breast pocket," Wyatt replied, maintaining his professional composure. "Did I ask for a debate, boy?" Mitchell's voice raised a terrifying octave, the slur slipping out with practiced ease. I said, hand over the documents. Keep your hands where I can see them. In the passenger seat, Dominic Rousseau's posture shifted. It was a microscopic movement, but to anyone trained in combat or security, it was the equivalent of a hammer cocking back on a revolver. Dominic reached slowly into his own jacket, deliberately avoiding sudden movements. "Officer," Dominic intervened, his gravelly, authoritative voice cutting through the noise of the rain. "I am Agent Rousseau with State Executive Protection. The driver is Agent Hughes. We are operating an official state vehicle. You need to lower your weapon hand and step back." Mitchell scoffed, shining the flashlight over to Dominic. An older white man in a suit riding shotgun with a younger black driver. Mitchell's twisted logic couldn't process the dynamic. He assumed Dominic was some high-priced private security, or a corporate handler, a group local cops traditionally despised for their arrogance. "State protection, my ass," Mitchell spat. "You boys think you can buy some flashing lights and fake badges on the internet and do whatever you want in my jurisdiction? I clocked you swerving back there." "That is a fabrication," Wyatt stated calmly. "I maintained my lane and a speed of exactly 45 miles per hour. The dash camera running on this vehicle is currently uploading telemetry data directly to State Police Headquarters." The mention of a camera infuriated Mitchell. It challenged his authority, challenging his control of the narrative. He swung the flashlight beam aggressively toward the back seat, trying to find more leverage, more reasons to escalate. The harsh white light hit Justice Josephine Langford. She did not flinch. She sat perfectly upright, her dark eyes locking directly onto the glare of the flashlight. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, a string of modest pearls, and an expression that had withered seasoned defense attorneys and arrogant prosecutors alike. Mitchell peered through the rain-streaked glass. His mind, heavily clouded by implicit bias and overt prejudice, made an immediate, catastrophic calculation. He didn't see a judge. He saw an older black woman sitting in the back of an SUV, being driven by a young black man. "Who's in the back?" Mitchell demanded, tapping his flashlight aggressively against the thick window glass. "This your mother, boy? Or are you running a high-end taxi service without a medallion?" Silence fell inside the cabin. It was not a silence of fear, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb with the timer ticking down to 0. "Officer," Justice Langford finally spoke. Her voice didn't compete with the rain. It pierced right through it. "You have pulled over a state-registered vehicle without probable cause. You have used racially charged language toward my driver. You are currently resting your hand on your firearm during a non-threatening encounter. I strongly advise you to contact your shift supervisor immediately." Mitchell let out a harsh, ugly laugh. The absolute sheer nerve of this woman telling him how to do his job in his county. The badge pinned to his chest felt like a shield that gave him absolute immunity against the people he deemed beneath him. "Listen to me very carefully, lady." Mitchell leaned closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. "I don't care if you think you know your rights. Out here on this highway, I am the law. You people think you can just talk your way out of everything. Not tonight." Mitchell took half a step back and unclipped the retention strap on his holster. The unmistakable snap of the thick leather echoed over the rain. "Driver, out of the vehicle!" "Now!" Mitchell commanded, drawing his weapon halfway out of the holster. "Passenger, keep your hands on the dashboard. Lady in the back, keep your mouth shut." The dynamic in the car inverted instantly. This was no longer a disrespectful traffic stop. It was an active, lethal threat to a state official. "Negative," Wyatt said, his voice dropping an octave, completely losing the polite veneer. He did not move to unbuckle his seatbelt. Dominic's radio clicked on. He didn't use the handset. He used the lapel mic pinned to his collar. "Dispatch, this is Detail Alpha. We have a code red on Route 114. Local unit has gone hostile and is unholstering his weapon. Requesting immediate tactical backup from state troopers. Barracks 9. Mitchell heard the radio transmission. Panic, mixed with a sudden surge of adrenaline, flooded his system. He thought they were bluffing, trying to intimidate him with fake radio chatter. "I said, get out of the car!" Mitchell screamed, fully drawing his 9mm sidearm and pointing it directly at Wyatt's chest through the open window. Before Mitchell could even blink, the response was executed with terrifying synchronized precision. Wyatt threw his left shoulder forward, entirely unbothered by the gun in his face, his right hand dropping to the heavy Sig Sauer securely holstered at his hip. Simultaneously, Dominic threw open his passenger door, launching his 200-pound frame out into the driving rain, pulling his own weapon and clearing the hood of the SUV in 2 massive strides. Within exactly 2 seconds, Officer Mitchell found himself standing in the mud, his gun pointed at Wyatt, while a deeply furious, heavily armed state protection agent had a laser-sighted weapon aimed squarely at the side of his skull from across the hood. "Drop the weapon! Drop the weapon now!" Dominic roared, his voice echoing like thunder across the empty highway. "State police, you drop that weapon or I will put you in the ground." Inside the back seat, Justice Langford calmly picked up her secure mobile phone, bypassing local dispatch entirely, and dialed the personal cell phone number of the county police commissioner. The trap Mitchell thought he had set had just clamped down viciously on his own leg. The torrential rain felt as though it were turning into solid sheets of ice against Officer Bradley Mitchell's face. But the cold was nothing compared to the sudden, freezing terror paralyzing his chest. Time seemed to snap to a grinding halt on the desolate stretch of Route 114. Mitchell stood frozen, his service weapon trembling in his grip, aimed at Wyatt's chest through the open window of the Suburban. But Mitchell's eyes were no longer on the young driver. They were wide, heavily dilated, and locked squarely on the red laser dot dancing menacingly across his own right cheekbone. Dominic Russo had not just drawn his weapon. He had moved with the lethal, practiced fluidity of a man who had spent decades neutralizing high-level threats. He stood behind the cover of the heavy engine block, his 2-handed grip on his customized Glock 19 perfectly stable despite the driving storm. "I will not repeat myself, local." Dominic's voice roared again, possessing a terrifying, metallic edge that cut entirely through the sound of the pelting rain. "Lower the firearm, place it on the pavement, and step back with your hands interlaced behind your head. You have exactly 3 seconds before I consider you an active shooter." Inside the vehicle, Wyatt had not drawn his weapon, but his thumb had quietly disengaged the retention hood of his holster. His eyes remained locked on Mitchell's trigger finger. Wyatt's breathing was slow and measured. "Listen to him, Mitchell," Wyatt said, his voice eerily calm, devoid of any anger or panic. "You are experiencing an adrenaline dump. Breathe. Do not make a mistake you cannot undo. Put the gun down." Mitchell's mind was short-circuiting. The power fantasy he had been riding just 60 seconds prior had violently shattered, replaced by the grim realization that the older man aiming at him from across the hood was entirely prepared to pull the trigger. Mitchell slowly, almost mechanically, began to lower his 9mm pistol. In the back seat, completely unbothered by the drawn weapons outside her window, Justice Josephine Langford pressed her secure mobile phone to her ear. The line connected after 2 rings. "Commissioner Callahan," the gruff, sleepy voice of Robert Callahan, the county police commissioner, answered. It was nearly midnight, and he had clearly been awoken. "Robert, it is Justice Langford," Josephine said, her voice carrying an icy, commanding stillness that immediately woke the commissioner from his stupor. "Justice Langford, good evening, ma'am. Is everything all right? Are you calling regarding the appellate decision tomorrow?" Callahan asked, the confusion evident in his tone. "I am calling you from the back of my state-issued vehicle on Route 114, northbound," Josephine stated, enunciating every syllable with terrifying clarity. "One of your patrolmen, a young man whose name tag reads Mitchell, has just illegally detained my vehicle. Furthermore, he has drawn his service weapon and aimed it directly at the chest of my driver, Agent Hughes." There was a dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The sound of Callahan violently knocking over a glass of water on his nightstand echoed through the earpiece. "He did what?" Callahan gasped, the blood draining from his face. "Justice Langford, are you unharmed? Is your detail engaged? Agent Russo currently has your officer at gunpoint from across the hood of my vehicle to prevent him from discharging his weapon," Josephine explained casually, as if she were dictating a grocery list. "I suggest you dispatch the state police to our exact GPS coordinates immediately, Robert. If your man twitches, my detail will be forced to eliminate the threat. Do you understand me?" "God Almighty," Callahan breathed, sheer panic overtaking him. "I am patching directly to the state police barracks right now. Hold the line, Josephine. Please, tell your agents to hold their fire. Help is less than 2 minutes away." Outside, Mitchell finally let his weapon slip from his fingers. It clattered loudly onto the wet asphalt. "Kick it away! Kick it under the car!" Dominic barked, not lowering his Glock a single inch. Mitchell blindly kicked the pistol with his heavy boot, sending it skidding beneath the Suburban. He raised his hands, his fingers trembling violently, and laced them behind his head. He was hyperventilating, the rain mixing with the cold sweat pouring down his forehead. "I didn't know," Mitchell stammered, his voice cracking, the racist bravado entirely evaporated. I thought the vehicle was—" "Shut your mouth," Dominic ordered, moving out from behind the hood, keeping his weapon trained on Mitchell's chest as he closed the distance. "Turn around, face your cruiser. Do not move a single muscle." Before Mitchell could even turn fully around, the distant, wailing shriek of sirens pierced the night. Within seconds, the sound morphed into a deafening roar. Over the crest of the hill, a terrifying procession of headlights and blue strobes broke through the darkness. It was not local backup. It was a swarm of heavy state police interceptors. 4 Dodge Charger pursuit vehicles and 2 tactical SUVs descended upon the scene, boxing Mitchell's lone cruiser in completely. The vehicles screeched to a halt, angles intersecting to create a barricade. Doors flew open, and nearly a dozen heavily armed state troopers swarmed out into the rain. "State police, hands in the air! Get on the ground! Face down on the pavement! Now!" The commands came from multiple directions. Trooper First Class Harrison, a massive mountain of a man in a dark rain slicker, led the charge. He didn't wait for Mitchell to comply. Harrison closed the gap, grabbed the back of Mitchell's uniform collar, and violently swept the corrupt cop's legs out from under him. Mitchell hit the freezing, puddle-soaked asphalt hard, face first. The wind was entirely knocked out of his lungs. Before he could even gasp for air, Harrison's heavy knee dropped squarely into the center of his spine, pinning him to the ground. Steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around Mitchell's wrists, biting into his skin. "Detail Alpha, this is Trooper Harrison. Suspect is secured," Harrison shouted over the rain, looking up at Dominic. Dominic finally lowered his weapon, clicking the safety back into place before sliding it smoothly into his shoulder holster. He nodded to Harrison. "Good response time, Trooper. The suspect's weapon is under the front axle of my vehicle. Secure it for evidence." Mitchell lay in the muddy water, his cheek pressed against the rough, freezing pavement. The blue and red strobe lights from a half-dozen cruisers flashed intensely around him, illuminating the catastrophic ruin of his life. He looked up, his vision blurry from the rain, and watched as Wyatt calmly stepped out of the driver's side door, adjusting his suit jacket, not a single drop of sweat on his brow. Mitchell was completely, utterly trapped. The predator had just become the prey. The torrential downpour finally began to ease into a steady, persistent drizzle, though the flashing blue lights of the state police interceptors still painted the wet highway in erratic, strobing colors. The perimeter had been completely locked down. Yellow crime scene tape was already being strung between the cruisers, effectively closing the northbound lanes of Route 114. Officer Bradley Mitchell was yanked to his feet by two burly state troopers. He was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, his uniform covered in mud and gravel. They dragged him toward the back of a state cruiser, pushing him roughly against the rear door to search him. Mitchell's mind raced, desperately trying to construct a narrative that could save him. "You guys don't understand," Mitchell pleaded, his voice high-pitched and frantic. He looked at Trooper Harrison, who was thoroughly patting down his pockets. They were driving erratically. The windows were totally blacked out. The driver refused to comply with my lawful orders. I felt my life was in danger. You have to believe me. I'm on the job. I'm one of you. Harrison pulled Mitchell's spare magazines from his duty belt and tossed them into an evidence bag held by another trooper. He looked at Mitchell with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are not one of us," Harrison growled, his voice a low rumble. "You're a liability and a badge." A sleek, unmarked silver Ford Explorer pulled up to the perimeter tape, its hidden grille lights flashing silently. The doors opened, and Captain Victoria Dawson stepped out. Dawson was the commanding officer of the State Police Internal Affairs and Executive Protection Division. She was a sharply featured woman in her early 50s, wearing a heavy waterproof tactical jacket over her dress uniform. Her eyes scanned the scene, taking in the disarmed local cop, the heavily guarded Suburban, and her own troopers securing the area. Dawson marched directly toward the black Suburban. Dominic Russo met her halfway, extending a hand. "Captain Dawson," Dominic said, his tone thoroughly professional. "The scene is secure. Subject has been disarmed and taken into custody." "Agent Russo, are you and Agent Hughes uninjured?" Dawson asked, her piercing gaze darting toward the driver's side, where Wyatt was standing quietly by the door. "We are perfectly fine, Captain. However, the local officer escalated a routine, baseless traffic stop to a lethal force encounter within 3 minutes. He drew his firearm on Agent Hughes and aimed for center mass." Dawson's jaw tightened. "Did your dash system capture the audio and video?" "Every second of it," Wyatt interjected, stepping forward. "Both exterior wide-angle and interior cabin feeds. The telemetry data proving we never exceeded the speed limit or swerved was live-streamed to dispatch the moment his light bar activated." Dawson nodded firmly. She turned on her heel and walked over to where Mitchell was being held against the cruiser. Mitchell saw the gold captain's oak leaves on her collar and immediately tried to stand taller, trying to project some semblance of authority. "Captain, please let me explain," Mitchell begged, the panic leaking entirely through his facade. "These guys are lying. The driver was hostile. He reached for something. I had to draw my weapon to maintain control of the stop." Dawson stopped 3 feet from him. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She simply stared at him with a look of terrifying, cold calculation. "Officer Mitchell," Dawson began, her voice carrying easily in the damp night air. "In exactly 10 minutes, the county police commissioner, your precinct captain, and the district attorney are going to arrive on this highway. They are not coming here to back you up. They are coming here to personally witness the destruction of your career." Mitchell swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the rain. "Captain, I didn't do anything wrong. It was a lawful stop." "You pulled over a state-registered executive vehicle," Dawson corrected him, her tone completely merciless. "You utilized racially charged, derogatory language toward a sworn state protection agent. You unholstered your weapon and aimed it at a fellow law enforcement officer without provocation. And you did all of this while threatening the life of the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. The words hit Mitchell like a physical blow to the stomach. The air rushed out of his lungs. "The who?" Dawson didn't answer. She simply looked past him. The heavy, armored rear door of the Suburban opened with a solid, mechanical clack. Wyatt immediately stepped to the door, opening a large black golf umbrella to shield the passenger from the lingering drizzle. Justice Josephine Langford stepped out onto the wet asphalt. She looked immaculate. Her charcoal blazer was perfectly crisp, her posture entirely unbowed by the chaos that had just unfolded. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the cruiser where Mitchell was being held. The state troopers instinctively straightened up, stepping back slightly to give the Chief Justice the floor. Mitchell shrank against the side of the car. The horrific reality of his prejudice was staring him right in the face. The older black woman he had arrogantly assumed was a nobody, the woman he had ordered to keep her mouth shut, was the highest-ranking legal authority in the state. Justice Langford stopped just outside the reach of the umbrella, letting the light rain fall onto her shoulders. She looked at Mitchell. She didn't look at him with hatred. She looked at him with the profound, devastating pity of a judge observing a condemned man. "Officer Mitchell," Josephine said, her voice smooth, calm, and utterly lethal. "You told me earlier that out here on this highway, you are the law." Mitchell tried to speak, but his vocal cords seized. He could only shake his head, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "You are mistaken," Josephine continued, her gaze pinning him to the cruiser like a butterfly on a corkboard. "You are merely an enforcement mechanism of the law, a mechanism that has fundamentally failed. The law is a shield meant to protect the vulnerable from the malicious. Tonight, you chose to be the malicious. You allowed your bias, your unchecked ego, and your blatant racism to override your oath." "Your Honor, please," Mitchell whispered, tears of pure panic finally mixing with the rain on his cheeks. "I made a mistake. I just made a mistake." "A mistake is misreading a license plate," Josephine corrected him, her tone completely devoid of sympathy. "Drawing a deadly weapon on an innocent man because of the color of his skin is not a mistake. It is a crime. And it is a crime you committed while wearing a badge, which makes it a profound betrayal of public trust." She turned slightly, looking at Captain Dawson. "Captain, what are the preliminary charges?" "Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, official misconduct, reckless endangerment, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law, Your Honor," Dawson recited instantly. "All felonies. He will be processed at the state barracks, not his local precinct. He will be held without bail." Josephine nodded once. She looked back at the trembling, ruined man in the handcuffs. "You thought you were dealing with people who had no voice, Officer Mitchell," Josephine said softly, turning to walk back to her vehicle. "Tomorrow morning, you will find out just how loud the justice system can speak." Fluorescent lights buzzed with a nauseating, relentless hum inside Interrogation Room 4 at the State Police Central Barracks. The sterile, windowless room smelled of strong bleach and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the fresh, rain-soaked highway where Bradley Mitchell had stood just 3 hours earlier. Mitchell was no longer wearing his dark blue patrol uniform, nor did he possess his heavy duty belt or the badge that had fueled his arrogance. Those items had been seized, bagged, and tagged as critical evidence. Instead, he sat shivering in a shapeless, paper-thin orange detention jumpsuit. The heavy steel handcuffs tethering his wrists to the solid metal loop bolted to the interrogation table clinked loudly with his every nervous tremor. Mitchell looked absolutely hollowed out. The adrenaline had long since crashed, leaving him with a crippling, overwhelming sense of doom. Across the steel table, sat his union-appointed legal counsel, William Gallagher. Gallagher was a seasoned, cynical defense attorney who had spent 2 decades bailing out overzealous cops. However, tonight, Gallagher looked deeply nauseated. He kept rubbing his temples, refusing to make eye contact with his client. The heavy metal door clicked open, and Captain Victoria Dawson walked in, followed closely by the County District Attorney, Philip Montgomery. Montgomery was a notoriously aggressive prosecutor with zero tolerance for police corruption, especially when it threatened the public trust in his jurisdiction. Dawson carried a sleek silver laptop, which she deliberately set down on the table, flipping the screen open to face Mitchell and his lawyer. "Good morning, gentlemen," Montgomery said, his voice dripping with absolute frost. "We are going to make this exceptionally brief. Mr. Gallagher, I assume you have briefed your client on the catastrophic reality of his current situation?" "I have advised my client to remain silent, Philip," Gallagher replied wearily, leaning back in his creaking metal chair. "We are simply here to formally hear the charges before the arraignment. I want to discuss bail parameters." Montgomery let out a short, humorless laugh. "Bail? Bill, there is no universe where this man sees the outside of a cell pending trial. But before we discuss his extended stay in county lockup, Captain Dawson is going to show you exactly why I will not be offering a plea deal of any kind." Dawson tapped a key on the laptop. The screen flared to life, displaying the crystal-clear, high-definition dash-cam footage from Justice Langford's Suburban. Because the vehicle was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance tech used for executive protection, the video did not just show the front windshield. It showed a split screen, the exterior view of Mitchell approaching aggressively, and the interior cabin view illuminated by the dome light. The audio was horrifyingly pristine. Mitchell's voice boomed from the laptop speakers. "Did I ask for a debate, boy?" Gallagher visibly flinched at the racial slur. He closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. The video continued playing. It showed Dominic Russo, calm and professional, identifying himself and the driver as state executive protection agents. It captured Mitchell's sneering dismissal. Then, the camera shifted slightly as Mitchell aggressively aimed his flashlight into the back seat, harassing the Chief Justice herself. "This your mother, boy? Or are you running a high-end taxi service without a medallion?" Mitchell watched the screen, his face draining of whatever color it had left. Seeing his own behavior played back from an objective, third-party angle stripped away all the self-righteous justification he had built up in his head. He looked like a monster. He sounded like a petty, racist tyrant. Then came the climax. The video clearly showed Mitchell unholstering his weapon, completely unprovoked, and pointing it directly at Agent Wyatt Hughes's chest. Dawson paused the video on the exact frame where Mitchell's gun was leveled at the driver. The timestamp glowed brightly in the bottom corner. "Unprovoked escalation to lethal force," Montgomery stated coldly, tapping his pen against the table. "Targeting an on-duty state protection agent. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Aggravated assault. And to make matters worse, Internal Affairs raided your precinct about an hour ago. We pulled your personnel file, Mitchell." Mitchell's head snapped up, panic flaring in his bloodshot eyes. "My file?" "Yes, your file," Dawson interjected, crossing her arms. "Your precinct captain, John Reynolds, tried to bury 3 separate civilian complaints filed against you over the past 18 months for excessive use of force and racial profiling during traffic stops. He thought he could sweep your behavior under the rug to protect the department's statistics." Gallagher looked at Dawson, completely alarmed by this new information. "Captain Reynolds is involved?" "Captain Reynolds was suspended without pay 20 minutes ago," Montgomery said ruthlessly. "Justice Langford did not just call the county commissioner tonight. She made a direct phone call to United States Attorney General Merrick Garland's office in Washington. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division is dispatching a federal oversight team to your precinct by tomorrow afternoon. They are going to tear your department down to the studs, Mitchell. And you are the catalyst." Mitchell let out a choked, desperate sob. The magnitude of what he had done was finally crushing him. He had not just ruined his own life, he had inadvertently triggered a massive federal investigation into his entire chain of command. The hard karma he had been dodging for years had finally caught up, and it was arriving like a freight train. "I'll quit," Mitchell blurted out, tears spilling down his face, completely ignoring his lawyer's advice to stay quiet. "I'll resign right now. Take my pension. Just please don't send me to federal prison. They'll kill me in there. I have a wife. I have a mortgage." Montgomery leaned in close, his eyes completely devoid of mercy. "You should have thought about your wife and your mortgage before you pulled a loaded gun on a black man simply because you didn't like the car he was driving. You are an absolute disgrace to the badge you wore. The state will seek the maximum penalty on all counts." Morning sunlight poured through the towering, arched windows of the county courthouse, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the heavy, tense air of courtroom 101. The gallery was packed beyond maximum capacity. Every wooden bench was filled with local reporters, national news correspondents, civil rights advocates, and off-duty police officers who had come to witness the spectacle. The atmosphere was incredibly suffocating. Bradley Mitchell sat at the defense table, looking completely shattered. He was still wearing the bright orange county jail uniform. His wrists and ankles were securely shackled with heavy steel chains that rattled loudly every time he shifted his weight. He kept his head bowed, staring blankly at the scarred wooden surface of the table. He was entirely isolated. His life outside the courtroom had already collapsed with terrifying speed. Just 2 hours before the hearing, William Gallagher had handed Mitchell a manila envelope. Inside were expedited divorce papers, filed by Mitchell's wife, who had immediately packed up their 2 children and left the state to stay with her parents, horrified and deeply humiliated by the national news coverage of her husband's racist tirade. Furthermore, the local police union president, Frank Peterson, had held a live press conference at dawn, officially disavowing Mitchell's actions and severing all union-funded legal support. Gallagher was now operating merely as a court-appointed public defender until Mitchell could secure private counsel, which he could no longer afford. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, cutting through the low murmur of the crowded gallery. Everyone in the room stood at attention. From the heavy oak doors behind the bench emerged Judge Beatrice Corwin. She was a formidable, no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for handing down incredibly harsh sentences to public officials who abused their power. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and slammed her wooden gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. "Be seated," Judge Corwin ordered, opening the thick case file placed before her. She scanned the preliminary indictment, her expression growing darker with every page she turned. "We are here for the arraignment and bail hearing of State versus Bradley Mitchell. The charges are numerous and severe, including aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and federal civil rights violations." She looked over the top of her reading glasses, directly at the defense table. "Mr. Gallagher, how does your client plead?" Gallagher stood up, looking visibly exhausted. "Not guilty, Your Honor. At this time, we are formally requesting that Mr. Mitchell be released on bail pending trial. He is a lifelong resident of this county, a former public servant, and has no prior criminal convictions. He is not a flight risk." Before Gallagher could even finish his sentence, District Attorney Philip Montgomery stood up from the prosecution table, his posture rigid with righteous indignation. "Objection, Your Honor. The state strongly opposes bail in any amount," Montgomery stated, his voice echoing powerfully through the large courtroom. "The defendant is absolutely a threat to the community. He used his position of authority, his state-issued firearm, and the cover of darkness to terrorize innocent citizens. The dashcam footage, which has already been entered into evidence, unequivocally proves that Mr. Mitchell is prone to extreme, racially motivated violence without any provocation whatsoever. Montgomery paused, letting his words sink into the silent gallery. He gestured toward Mitchell. Furthermore, Your Honor, the victims of this assault were not just ordinary citizens. The defendant drew a lethal weapon on 2 sworn state protection agents and unlawfully detained the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. If an armed, uniformed police officer is willing to attempt a roadside execution of a state official over a bruised ego, there is absolutely no telling what he would do to an average citizen if allowed back on the streets. He is a profound danger to society. Judge Corwin nodded slowly, turning her piercing gaze back to Mitchell. The disgraced cop couldn't even look up to meet her eyes. He was trembling so violently that the chains around his ankles clinked against the chair legs. "Mr. Gallagher," Judge Corwin said, her voice dripping with judicial disdain, "your client took an oath to protect and serve. Instead, he chose to operate as an armed thug, utilizing a badge as a shield for his own virulent bigotry. The sheer audacity required to draw a weapon on a compliant driver over a fabricated traffic violation is staggering." She closed the file with a loud, decisive snap. "The public must have absolute faith that those who enforce the law are not immune to it," Judge Corwin declared, her voice ringing out like a death knell for Mitchell's freedom. Given the overwhelming video and audio evidence, the severity of the felonies charged, and the egregious abuse of official power, this court finds that the defendant poses a clear and present danger to the public. She raised her gavel high into the air. "Bail is categorically denied. The defendant is hereby remanded to the custody of the county sheriff until the conclusion of this trial. And let the record reflect that given the federal civil rights probes now active in this jurisdiction, this court will recommend transferring the defendant to a high-security federal penitentiary should he be convicted." The gavel slammed down like a thunderclap. Bang! Mitchell completely broke down. A loud, guttural sob tore from his throat as the sheriff's deputies immediately stepped forward, grabbing him roughly by the shoulders. They hauled him to his feet, ignoring his weeping. As they dragged the disgraced, ruined cop out of the courtroom through the side door, the gallery remained entirely silent, watching the brutal, unyielding hammer of justice smash a corrupt man's life into absolute dust. 8 months later, the biting, freezing winds of late February rattled the heavy, reinforced glass of the United States District Court. Inside the cavernous, wood-paneled federal courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating weight of absolute, inescapable finality. The local state trial had never even materialized. The moment the federal government intervened, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division completely consumed the case, elevating it from a local scandal to a massive, sweeping federal indictment. Bradley Mitchell sat at the defense table, but he was virtually unrecognizable from the arrogant, aggressive patrolman who had strutted through the rain on Route 114. The past 8 months in federal hold, spent entirely in administrative segregation for his own physical protection, had aged him a decade. His posture was perpetually hunched, his shoulders caved inward. The stark white federal prison jumpsuit hung loosely on his dramatically thinned frame. His hair had completely grayed at the temples, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, haunted by the brutal reality of his shattered existence. The federal oversight probe initiated by Justice Josephine Langford's phone call had acted like a sledgehammer to a rotten foundation. The FBI and DOJ investigators did not just look at Mitchell, they tore up the floorboards of his entire precinct. What they found was a terrifying, deeply entrenched syndicate of corruption, quota padding, and systemic racial profiling entirely orchestrated by Captain John Reynolds. The ultimate twist of hard karma had arrived when Mitchell realized the brotherhood he thought protected him did not exist. The very moment the federal agents raided the precinct, Captain Reynolds had attempted to entirely frame Mitchell as a lone wolf, falsifying backdated internal memos to claim he had been trying to fire Mitchell for months. Betrayed, abandoned, and facing a potential life sentence for federal civil rights violations, Mitchell had no choice but to completely flip on his former commanding officer. He spent dozens of hours in heavily guarded interrogation rooms, handing the FBI every piece of evidence, every text message, and every illegal directive Reynolds had ever issued. Because of Mitchell's desperate cooperation, Captain Reynolds and 6 other senior officers were currently sitting in federal custody, indicted under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The precinct was placed under an aggressive federal consent decree. "All rise," the court deputy announced, his voice echoing sharply off the high ceilings. The Honorable William Rosenberg, a federal judge known for his merciless sentencing in police corruption cases, took his seat behind the towering mahogany bench. He looked down at Mitchell with an expression of profound, chilling indifference. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Rosenberg began, his voice amplified by the microphone, filling the silent courtroom. "The court has reviewed the exhaustive plea agreement reached between your defense counsel and Assistant United States Attorney Laura Kensington. You have agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law and 1 count of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. In exchange for your ongoing cooperation against your former commanding officers, the government is capping its sentencing recommendation at 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Do you fully understand these terms?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mitchell whispered, his voice cracking, barely audible over the hum of the courtroom's ventilation system. He leaned closer to the microphone. "Yes, I understand. Before I formally accept this plea and hand down my sentence," Judge Rosenberg stated, folding his hands together, "the court recognizes that the primary victim of this egregious assault is present and wishes to deliver an impact statement." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Justice Josephine Langford walked down the center aisle. She moved with the same unyielding, majestic grace that she had possessed on the side of that rain-slicked highway. She wore a tailored navy blue suit, her expression composed, entirely devoid of vindictiveness, but radiating absolute authority. She was flanked quietly by Agent Wyatt Hughes and Agent Dominic Russo, both men wearing impeccably cut suits, their presence a silent, powerful reminder of the night Mitchell's reign of terror ended. Justice Langford stepped up to the wooden podium facing the judge, but she slowly turned her body so she could look directly at the defense table. Mitchell visibly flinched, dropping his gaze to his shackled hands. "Look at me, Mr. Mitchell," Josephine commanded softly. The absolute power in her voice forced his chin up. He met her eyes, tears instantly welling in his own. "For 8 months, the media has focused on the dramatic confrontation on that highway," Josephine spoke, her resonant voice captivating every single person in the gallery. "They have focused on the drawn weapons, the flashing lights, and the shocking revelation of my identity. But that is not what matters here today. What matters is the terrifying reality of what would have happened if I were not a state Supreme Court justice. What if Agent Hughes was simply a young man driving home from a late shift? What if he did not possess the elite tactical training to remain perfectly calm while a loaded firearm was aimed at his chest?" She took a slow, deliberate breath. "You did not pull us over because of a traffic violation. You pulled us over because you felt entitled to dominate those you perceived as lesser than yourself. You weaponized the incredible power of the state to enforce your own bigotry. You betrayed the sacred oath you swore, poisoning the well of public trust for every honest, dedicated law enforcement officer who actually risks their life to protect their community. Mitchell squeezed his eyes shut, a tear rolling down his hollow cheek. I do not stand here today seeking vengeance, Josephine continued, turning her gaze back to Judge Rosenberg. Vengeance is petty, and it does not heal the wounds of a broken system. I stand here to ensure absolute accountability. The badge is a symbol of public service, not a shield for criminality. Let the sentence handed down today serve as a permanent, echoing warning to any officer who believes their prejudice is greater than the law. Justice Langford nodded to the judge and walked back to her seat, sitting down beside Wyatt and Dominic. Judge Rosenberg adjusted his glasses, his face set in stone. There is absolutely nothing further to deliberate. Bradley Mitchell, based on your own admissions, your egregious abuse of power, and the terrifying threat you pose to innocent lives, I hereby sentence you to exactly 15 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. You will serve this time at United States Penitentiary, Lewisburg. There is no possibility of early parole. May you use the next decade and a half to deeply reflect upon the lives you attempted to destroy and the life you have rightfully forfeited. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with deafening finality. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. United States Marshals immediately flanked Mitchell, grabbing him by the biceps, as they hauled him away to begin his long, miserable sentence in federal prison. He looked over his shoulder one last time. He saw Justice Langford, standing tall, watching him leave, the ultimate embodiment of the justice he had so arrogantly tried to pervert. Hard karma had not just knocked on his door, it had completely leveled his house. What a massive, devastating dose of hard karma. Officer Mitchell thought he was an untouchable king of the highway, but his blatant racism and ego cost him his freedom, his family, and brought a federal hammer down on his entire corrupt department. Justice Langford proved that no one is above the law, and true accountability always wins. What did you think of the Chief Justice's powerful courtroom speech? Let us know your favorite moment in the comments. If you loved this story of justice served, make sure to like the video, share it, and subscribe for more.